morning. Just a few quick announcements. We've got the social hour at 5:30 at McClurg, which is the dining hall. And remember how last time I said there'd be badminton and there wasn't badminton? Today there is going to be badminton, so bring your badminton rackets. No, you don't have to, we have them. So then tonight at 9, there's going to be a dance at the pub. It's not like high school, you don't have to have a date. If you want, you could have a date. I'm just saying I don't have a date. And then in the morning, if you're not too tired, you could do yoga at the Fowler Center at 9 a.m. Or you could take a cool hike past a waterfall, and it's going to leave from here at 9 a.m. also. And now I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Hudgins.
It was a delightfully nasal introduction, Isabel. I'm going to start with a poem that's still in progress. I have been writing poems for, 5 years now, every now and then by these two house painters who I don't understand quite who they are, but here they're in a discussion that varies somewhere between homophobia and the polymorphous perverse. The poem is called, I hope there are no children here, Cocksucker. It's dialogue. I hate fucking September. Reminds you of school? Yeah, that and the fact that it's like living August all over again. Sweat always in my eyes, sunburn on my neck, and a rash from all the goddamn paint dust stuck to my face. You could wear a mask. I hate the mask. I feel like I'm suffocating. There's that. And now at home, the AC's broke. It's too damn hot to sleep, so me and Gwen get into it all night. Sounds good to me. Not that kind of dickweed. We squabble. That bird nest we scooped out yesterday, I still had feathers and straw stuck to my neck when I got home. She asked, "What's that?" I told her. "What kind of bird?" she asked, and I said, "Maybe it was a yellow-bellied gutter bird." Out it went, and its damn eggs too. She got all quivery-lipped and said that wrens and finches eat bugs and bluebirds are endangered, though she could give a rip about blue jays or pigeons and robins or bullies, so it's okay to kill them. I said there's only one bird I'd recognize, and so far I haven't seen a damn bald eagle nest in a gutter in Suffolk fucking acres. I just scoop them all out and keep working. Daddy's got gourds up for purple martins. Nice to drink beer and watch the martins swoop, picking mosquitoes out of the air at dusk. I'm not that bored yet, and I got a TV. I'd turn it to the Purple Martin channel. Remember when Pete Dyson had us paint around that bird nest on his dryer vent and later bitched about the spot we skipped? Well, I told Gwen that story and called Dyson a stupid cocksucker. She said, "Don't say that. I'm a cocksucker, aren't I? You like it when I suck your cock, and I don't like it when you make it sound nasty." I said, "I don't really think Pete Dyson sucks cocks. And if he did, I wouldn't like it. But he could. I've never seen a Mrs. Dyson. Being called a cocksucker is different from when you suck my cock. But I could tell that sounded stupid even as I said it, though it's true. You close your eyes, I bet Pete Dyson's lips would probably feel about the same. Don't go there. New condenser fan is due Monday. I wouldn't even want my pecker sucked in an unair-conditioned house right now. I would. Really? Hot as this? I would. Might be a while before it happens, though. I really hate it when authors come in and say, I just kind of hear these people and I don't really know what they're talking about. But that's kind of where I am with that one. I'm going to read from a new book, and if I have a little time at the end, I'll read from another new book, this one of poems. But I have this memoir out called The Joker, about being a compulsive joke teller. And the poems get into pretty heavy weather. There are jokes about sex and homophobia, bestiality, and there's a swath of jokes about the racist jokes that I heard while I was growing up. So in this passage, you're going to hear the N-word. It is reportage. I'm not advocating racism, but simply sharing with you the world and the humor that I grew up in. It's called A Court Low, Chapter 6. Don't tell your father, Mom said, whenever she told me a racist joke. She didn't need to warn me. With this kind of humor, my mother wavered somewhere between my father's irascible probity and her brother's nasty delight. When she repeated them, I often heard my Uncle Buddy's voice in the background, as well as her own guilt at setting a bad example for her son. The human need to pass on something she found compelling, funny, or perplexing overrode her guilt and became part of the joke's power and part of its pleasure. I loved her warning me to silence. It made explicit the grown-upness of our forbidden, disreputable laughter, which was an adult intoxicant, like her Pall Malls or the scotch she sometimes allowed herself at night when watching Johnny Carson's opening monologue on The Tonight Show. When she drank, she inevitably sipped cheap scotch, Clan McGregor, out of a thick glass that once held a frozen shrimp cocktail. With that bit of watered scotch and Johnny Carson cracking wise on the TV, she occasionally shared a joke she'd been mulling over till she had to tell it. A colored man suddenly finds himself in front of St. Peter at the pearly gates, she said, when I was 13. This was an interesting beginning. We were Baptist. We didn't believe in saints. In the radical Protestant democracy of faith, the Apostle Peter had no more of a special standing with Jesus than each one of us did. From hearing hundreds of sermons and Sunday school lessons, I knew this doctrinal verity before I knew the multiplication tables. By repeating the joke, she accepted for the purposes of the story a premise she considered Catholic mumbo-jumbo. St. Peter asked the colored man how he died. I don't remember, the man tells him. We have to know. We have to fill out these forms and decide if you're going to heaven or the hot place, St. Peter says. He thinks for a few moments and then asked, what's the last thing you remember? Well, I was attending this white Baptist church. Everybody was real friendly. The preacher preached up a storm, and when he invited those who wanted to be baptized and join the church to walk down the aisle, I did. They was real nice about it. They dressed me in a pretty green satin robe, led me to the baptismal font, and sang a glorious hymn. That's all you remember, St. Peter said. Try harder. Something else must have happened. Let me see, says the black man. Oh yes, just as I was being dunked in the water, the preacher said, bye-bye, nigger, bye-bye. My mother chanted the punchline triumphantly, her voice rising as she sang out, bye, bye, falling as she sneered nigger, and then soaring gloriously as she repeated, bye, bye, before she gave herself over to laughter. Did I laugh? I did. We were laughing, weren't we, at hypocritical Christians who demonstrated with homicidal glee their lack of true Christianity. The joke pointed out the conflict between how we acted and how we were supposed to act. Man is the only animal that laughs and weeps, for he is the only animal that is struck with the difference between what things are and what they should be, said William Hazlitt. The joke could not possibly really imply that killing African American converts to keep the church sacred was a good idea, could it? There wasn't enough wit in the joke to disguise its ugliness, if that's what it meant. Anyway, didn't our suburban church in Montgomery, like almost all Southern Baptist churches, prohibit by a vote of the congregation blacks from joining? Even today, the old lament of that time remains true. 11 to noon on Sunday is the most segregated hour of the American week. As a young teenager, in the last years of such earnest innocence, I wondered why African Americans would care to worship in a church that purposely excluded them. How can you force your way into fellowship, I asked myself, though I knew my church was wrong, cowardly, and unchristian to turn anyone away. I was confused, but my mother was adamant. She herself would rather die, she said, than join a church that didn't want her. And she didn't understand why the coloreds, unless they were just troublemakers, didn't feel the same way. They had their own churches, and they should go where they were wanted. Her anger came through in the exuberance with which she told the joke. She seemed to identify just a bit too much with the homicidal preacher, and she took a bit too much delight in the colored man getting his comeuppance for his uppity desire to join a church that didn't want him. I was right to understand the joke as a joke about entrenched and murderous racists, but because I loved her and didn't want to think badly of her, I didn't see that she also identified with racists like her brother. I was too young to see how someone could in good faith believe two contradictory things at the same time, especially since I knew Mom had often sat in military chapels with black worshipers, and when they were overseas, she and my father had sent me to a Sunday school taught by a black man. Before we moved back to the States, to Montgomery, my father was stationed at a NATO base outside Paris, and my Sunday school class on the base chapel was taught by a handsome black NCO, whom I'll call William. When William talked softly but intently about Jesus and the Bible, I felt as though I were in the presence of an apostle. The small storeroom where we met behind the chapel became a direct extension of Galilee. We were walking with Jesus. William possessed an otherworldly charisma in both the theological and popular meanings of the word. And when he taught the class, his faith and passion enlarged him. My troubled questions, I was 14 then, about evil, doubt, God's will, and God's essence, never irked him as they did my father and most other adults who, when boxed into a theological corner, said with rhetorical shrug, some things we just have to take on faith, an aggravating and complacent evasion. They were uncomfortable, afraid or unable to venture into the dark emotional and spiritual places where logic broke down. Those were the places I spent much of my time, and William, leaning over the table, eyes locked on mine, intent, but not so intent as to make me turn away, was at ease in those intellectual dead ends. Even when William had to resort to the take-it-on-faith line, which is an almost inevitable readout in theology, he was articulate and thoughtful about it, though he didn't, as far as I remember, ever let a ray of doubt escape his orbit. He was the most, and I'm tempted to say the only, thoughtful person I'd ever met in Sunday school. The teachers were often eccentric about what aspects of the faith they emphasized. When I was 8, a honey blonde college girl told my vacation Bible class with blissful longing how much she looked forward to dying. Really? You want to die? I asked. I couldn't imagine it. From as early as I can remember, I've been terrified of death. Yes, she assured us third graders, she very much wanted to die. She couldn't wait to free herself of this world, of strife and go to heaven, where she would be at peace in the love of God. With the over-emphatic way she said love, I wondered if she had just broken up with her boyfriend. But her longing for death, which brought tears to her eyes, was clearly real. Seeing she had disturbed me, she later came down and bent over me while I was studying a picture on the wall of Jesus knocking on a heavy wooden door. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. Her hair swung across my face. She let it lie against my cheek for an uncomfortably long time, and inside the joy she was trying to radiate, I felt the unhappiness behind her proclaimed bliss. Even at 8, I thought, pleased with my own callousness, that if she were so eager to die, she could, with minimal effort, fulfill her own wish. A steak knife or plastic dry cleaning bag would do the trick. I was a boy. I knew these things. In the hall outside the church classroom in Paris, or talking to my parents in the aisle after Sunday school and before services began, William was oddly diminished, transformed into simply a trim, polite man in a blue blazer, and I was startled to notice he was shorter than my father. In our small classroom, freed from the presence of men who outranked him, he was imposing and magnetic while being enormously calm. I have never before or since desired so much to sit in someone's presence and learn from him. I would have liked to be him. I loved William's deep pastoral interest in Gloria, the one other regular student in this class, and the callow white officer's son I knew myself to be. My father liked everything about the arrangement: my interest in religion, the sergeant's pervasive faith, and my studying with a black man. My mother didn't seem to care one way or the other, though I sensed she was slightly apprehensive about my becoming too swept up in religion. I'd never had such sustained, serious attention from an adult as I had from William, though I wondered how much we were Gloria and Andrew to him, and how much we were indistinct souls, impersonal obligations. He was leading to the narrow path and the straight gate. When I told my father that William had mentioned he was planning to leave the Air Force and go into the ministry in the States, my father said, almost blandly, "That's not going to be easy for him." How come? His wife is French, and they had a baby, Dad said. I'd known William lived on the economy, which meant off base, outside of military housing. Few people chose to do that because French real estate was expensive and complex to negotiate. By saying French, Dad expected me to hear white, which I did, and to understand that William's interracial marriage and mixed-race child would present difficulties in the States in the mid-60s. I did understand, but I did not feel sorry for William. He was too strong in the Lord to warrant my concern, much less my pity. I never saw William's wife, though I looked for her, glancing over his shoulder as he came down the church aisle, trying to see if she was walking behind him. When he sat, I kept darting looks in his direction to see if she had come in late and slipped into the pew beside him. He was always alone. I was curious about William's personal life, especially about his wife, because I'd never seen a white woman with a black man. But I was also dying to see a French evangelical. Didn't William's wife have to be an evangelical too? A French evangelical fundamentalist. It was a concept so exotic, I had trouble grasping it. I still do. My unnuanced admiration for William acquired nuance with a jolt the Sunday he brought his 2-year-old daughter to class. Sarah was the first mixed-race child I'd ever seen, so I'm sure I studied her with more open curiosity than was polite. She had much lighter skin than her father. His face was longer, and her brownish hair curled loosely around her head. A few minutes into class, Sarah began to squirm on her father's lap, bored and restless as William expounded biblical text just above her head. A sharp jerk settled her for a moment, and then another jerk settled her again briefly before she started to sniffle and then cry. The sergeant, who had always been vastly patient with Gloria and me, held the child up, legs dangling in the air, glared at her, shook her, and snarled, "Ça va, Sarah, ça va. Ça va, Sarah, ça va," he repeated into the girl's face, and waited with savage expectancy, as if the stunned child could answer. The ferocity of his voice rocked me back in my folding chair. Was William exasperated that taking care of the girl had impinged on the serious business of soul saving? Was he simply a stern father, embarrassed that his daughter was disturbing our Bible study? Why so harsh? Was William annoyed because he'd wanted to present a model of good black behavior to us white kids? I couldn't tell, and I was unhappy at letting race enter my thinking at all. But I was disturbed on a personal level and disillusioned theologically to see the messenger of God's love turn wrathful with such small provocation. I was used to this kind of transformation at home, but I believed I'd seen in William a different way for men to be men, and maybe, given his patience with me, a different way for Christians to be fathers. And I'd been wrong, or maybe only partly wrong. Anyone can lose his temper, and I only saw William lose his this one memorable time. I still admired my vibrant teacher, but more guardedly, anxious now about my boyish desire to idealize people. If nothing else, the Old Testament teaches that the prophets aren't distinguished by even temperaments and sensitive natures, not even when their preaching is being heeded. After we left Paris, I never saw or heard about William again. In the way of military brats who grow up leaving people and places behind, I didn't expect to, though I've often wondered about him, his family, and his ministry in America. But William was the figure in the back of my head when I heard racist jokes, and perversely, it was my admiration for him that made me unable to take the racism of those jokes completely seriously. I knew better, and so I could laugh harder. I didn't remember hearing my mother ever tell a racist joke until my father was transferred to Alabama in June 1966, 2.5 years after George Wallace, in his first inauguration address, had declared segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Taking the oath of office, Wallace stood on the Bronze Star, marking the spot where Jefferson Davis had been sworn in as President of the Confederacy. During an American history field trip, I too stood on that star and proclaimed loudly, throwing my arms over my head, "I feel I have the power, yes, the power to tear the United States asunder." Mrs. War, that was really her name, told me to stop acting like an idiot and keep up with the rest of the class, or I'd miss the bus and have to walk back to school. Mom may not have previously told any racist jokes simply because she'd not heard any on an integrated military base. I never had. But shortly after we arrived in Montgomery, she told me the joke I think of as the racist joke of the 60s, partly because I heard it more often and from more people than any other, but also because its meaning strangely shifted the more I thought about it. Martin Luther King Jr. gets up one morning, glances in the mirror, and notices his forehead is turned white. At first, he doesn't think about it. He just pulls his fedora down over the pale area and goes about his business. But the next morning, he looks in the mirror again and sees his face is turned white down to his nose, and the day after that, he's white down to his neck. He must be sick, but more than that, he has a serious problem. Other African Americans won't accept him as a civil rights leader if he turns into a white man. Worried King goes to the doctor and explains how each day he's turned a little whiter from the top down. The doctor examines him, then goes into the back room, brings out a large jar of brown liquid, hands it to King, and says, "Drink this." King glugs it down, and then grimacing with distaste, an expression my mother acted out, he sputters, "That tastes like bullshit." "It is," the doctor said. "You were a court low." The joke startled me. Not only wasn't it funny, I was having trouble seeing how she could find it funny. It was a kid's joke, a poop joke. Why in the world was my mother telling me a poop joke? Despite its easy and ugly punchline, I laughed shallowly. I didn't want to discourage Mom from telling me jokes. At first I thought the joke was about a racist doctor who dupes a not very bright king into drinking a bucket of shit, bull poop in my mother's version, but not, I'm sure, in my uncle's. I'm sure Buddy was the source of the joke. I also tried to laugh at the famous preacher, already perceived as a saint and a prophet in the larger world, being brought down a peg. Was that how Mom meant the joke? Only after thinking about it for a couple of days did I realize with a jolt that she thought Martin Luther King Jr. was full of shit. That understanding, which mildly embarrassed me, led to another understanding, the more embarrassing and frightening one that I'm pretty sure my uncle meant to convey. Niggers are made of shit, and the essence of nigritude is shit. From that perspective, the only pleasure the joke offers is the grim and soulless pleasure of animosity. Later, as I continued to hear the joke, I saw it also implies that Martin Luther King Jr. was essentially a white man. Only the civil rights rhetoric, bullshit, that discomfited whites made him black. If King didn't keep renewing his racial identity with racial causes and rhetoric, he'd turn into a white man. My mother would have agreed that blacks and whites are essentially the same. It was my Uncle Buddy who saw African Americans as intrinsically inferior to whites, and a deeply held rage at their attempting to change the natural order ran through many of his jokes. I'll skip those. The jokes my mother told, even if they came to her from Buddy, were usually more story-like and ambiguous. They were also my mother's and my hidden homeopathic rebellion against my father, who was right to prescribe them, but typically counterproductive in his heavy-handedness. Mom and I shared, I thought at first, an understanding. While others believed the jokes denigrated blacks, we recognized the joke wasn't on the victim, but on the perpetrator, the racist, and not the victim of racism. But the truth is more complicated. Once or twice, Mom mentioned Martin Luther Coon and chuckled. I was disappointed in her, I admit, and troubled that fear led to anger, and anger to leaden ugliness. And then I was ashamed for feeling superior to my mother. Let me jump ahead a little bit to the end of this chapter. This ends with a joke about the black man who goes to register to vote in Mississippi. I have a world we seem to be trying to go back to. I have an undergraduate degree from Harvard, a PhD from Yale. In 2 years, I was a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford before I returned to Harvard as a professor of Greek and Roman literature. Now that's all well and good, sneered my mother in the voice of the redneck sheriff at the voting registration office. But tell me, boy, can you read? My mother drew out the word read, enjoying the hick accent she gave it, the obtuseness of it, and the malicious pleasure the imagined sheriff takes in his willful abuse of authority. At the time, I was sure the butt of the joke was the redneck sheriff, who could not accept the superior attainments of a black man, and who was going to flagrantly misuse his power to frustrate the man's right to vote. In Nigger, the strange career of a troublesome word, Randall Kennedy recounts pretty much the same joke and says it's told by African Americans to satirize legal disenfranchisement. That's how I wanted to understand it too. Yet now I hear in my mother's voice something I didn't hear then. Along with her mockery of the sheriff and his redneck racism, I hear a touch of gratification at the sheriff's staunch refusal to admit the educated, successful, and apparently wealthy black man as his equal, much less his superior. My father's suits were not tailored, and his ties were acetate. Randall Kennedy tells another joke that he says black activists told to emphasize, quote, the depth of white racism all across the United States. What is a Negro with a PhD? Their response, Dr. Nigger. The subtle shifts of stance and presentation are everything in jokes, aren't they? My uncle told me the exact same joke, but his point was not to satirize white racism, but he was educating me. I may think I know how the world was supposed to be, he said, but he knew how it really was. And then he told me a joke that went one step further, one that demonstrated that whatever African Americans accomplished, they'd always be first and foremost niggers, not just in Buddy's eyes, but as an unalterable ontological state. What do you call a Negro with a PhD, an MD, and a law degree from Harvard, he asked. I was immediately wary. I knew it had to be a joke because in normal conversation, he never used the word Negro. And of course, in Griffin, Georgia, in the 1960s, there wasn't much chance he had actually met anyone, black or white, with those credentials. And if he had, he was not someone who would agonize over how to address the distinguished personage. All these thoughts plotted through my head as I pondered how to react, and then took the path of least resistance. I don't know, I said. What? My uncle took a moment to look at me. He knew I wasn't going to like the answer, and that meant he was going to enjoy telling it all the more. Within the next 2 years, I read the same joke in the autobiography of Malcolm X, and Malcolm X savored with rage the same point my uncle savored with triumph, slowly growling out the hard G's and R of the word, savoring them, but he said it, nigger. And that is my life. Let me read a couple of poems from this book. If you buy either of these new books, this one, a mere bargain at $15, and this one, an even greater bargain at $25, come up to me and I'll give you one of these free. Okay? Hardcovers. But anyway, this book is also a bit of, in poetry, a bit of a meditation on humor and its discontents. But I'll, in the interest, I will skip some of those and just jump into one called Birth of a Naturalist. Among Birth of a Naturalist. Among moist bromeliads, I was bored, and the soft-fingered ferns annoyed me like an ant touching my face and trailing her fingers down my cheek. What was I, a possession? In the gift shop where I desired nothing, a stranger confused boredom for balked desire and bought me a small pot with a blunt nub like a toad's brown snout jutting from dry soil. "Thank you," I said, "thank you," as I had been taught, and she departed, a plump whirl of black hair and red scarves. In my pocket, the pot rode my thigh like a damp stone, and because it was a secret, my secret, I began to love it. The next day, the toad's tumescent snout, now mossy green, cracked the packed dirt. On the windowsill, a rickety stalk rose and kept rising, until it fell into my bed, and with a toppled orchid in my arms, I slept until Mother woke me, and I was shamed. Again in secret, I tucked its root in spongy humus beyond our lawn, where spindly and limp-leafed it dwindled. Now, when I stretch out over its absence, the coarse vigor of its killers cushions me, and I see the lost orchid animating bracken, blackthorn, buttercup, and bramble. Morning glory overclimbs it all, green on green, blaring its beautiful and murderous alabaster trumpets, while twizzling vines unfurl, spin in sunlight, and clutching, caress my face. Oh, here's one. This is a kind of a horrifying meditation on the nature of laughter. The facts in the poem are true, and the poem is called Stalin's Laughter. At the secret policeman's feast, Pauker sagged, drunk, between two officers as he aped Zinoviev, hiccuping hilariously and staggering over watery, risible feet as he was dragged to the firing post. A devotee of Momus, son of night, Stalin was, and Pauker, knowing it, mouthed words he could not, in feigned panic, propel from his tongue, because dysphonia is always funny. The ratchet and catch of fractious breath, farcical. Pauker fell prostrate as Zinoviev had fallen, and he clutched the boots of his mock guards and cried, "Please, for God's sake, comrade, call Josip Vissarionovich." And Stalin, evoked as savior, roared, basso buffo. Pauker pushed harder, as a jester must, raising his arms to the banquet hall's beamed ceiling, as Zinoviev had raised his to the fuliginous brown clouds crowded over the prison yard, and cried, "Hear, O Israel, our God is the only God." Stalin choked on ungovernable mirth. Tears rolled into the mustache whose likeness, metaphorical to Blatella germanica, the German cockroach, paid Mandelstam's ambiguous passage to a common grave outside a transit camp. Stalin slashed his thick hand, "Enough, enough," commanding mercy upon the festive executioners, laughing helplessly. And to send you out into the world, I will read you a happier poem that is my elegy for my aunt. My aunt is the gentlest person in my family. That I know my wife's laughing because she said that doesn't count for much, and the sanest and kindest, was buried 2 years ago in Georgia, just called Bess. Fern fronds gracefully placed curved over the open casket, and in the sturdy sweeping breeze of air conditioning they swayed, waved, beckoned, and my aunt's hands moved, or seemed to, or I willed it so. Silver hair, silver dress, silver face, silver coffin. From the florist where she worked, perfect ferns, not a bent frond or broken rachis, not a single brown-tipped penna. Close, though, I saw one glossy green leaflet had fallen onto her thin silver hands, and on it a double row of black-brown spores, perfect, near circles, perfectly spaced, no sorus touching another, the way we buried her, halfway between her husband and her son. Thank you.